Hello and welcome to my sermon for the 12th of September. The first reading comes from Job chapter 31, reading verses 5 to 8. If I have walked with falsehood and my foot has hurried to deceit, let me be weighed in a just balance, and let God know my integrity. If my step has turned aside from the way, and my heart has followed my eyes, and if any spot has clung to my hands, then let me sow and another eat, and let what grows for me be rooted out. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Second reading comes from John's Gospel, chapter 8, verses 2 to 11. Early in the morning, Jesus came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and he began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They said this to test him, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. When they kept questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And once again he bent down and he wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away, one by one, beginning with the elders. And Jesus was left alone, with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on do not sin again." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. During work last week, it's been quite busy at CFAS, and I've used the phrase "draw a line in the sand" a couple of times last week to try and close off a piece of work with customers. You might know this kind of customer that goes, "And if only, and if only, oh, there's just this little change to make." So we had to tell them, look, let's draw a line in the sand. And as I hear that gospel reading this morning, I wonder whether that is another source for a well-known saying. You know the other one. Angie knows it very well about the... we won't say. But I mean, twice we're told Jesus wrote with his finger on the ground. We are not told what he wrote. Perhaps it was a line in the sand. And surely his action is indeed akin to drawing a line in the sand and asking, which side of the line do we stand? Are we without sin? Do we take enough care not to cross that line? Poor old Job. He's still wondering and pondering that question. Did he cross the line? If I have walked with falsehood, if my step has turned aside, if any spot has clung to my hands. The line in the sand, perhaps it is for us sometimes, isn't that clear for him. But it's obvious that only dwelling on the past is not going to resolve his present predicament. He continues to suffer physically, mentally, and now especially spiritually, as he feels deeply the injustice of what he's going through. And sadly, as we saw 2 weeks ago, his sense of distance or even total alienation from God distresses him above all else. If only God If only Job, could explain things from his own perspective. If only he could demonstrate his innocence for the wrongs which he assumes he's being punished for. So he sets out with determination that will require him to demonstrate both moral and spiritual integrity. Here it would really help to possibly even stop and read the whole of chapter 31 to grasp it. But I'll give you some pointers as we go along to verses within chapter 31. Because in this whole chapter, Job creates the atmosphere of a courtroom by making his appeal as a series of oaths of clearance. That's a legal device in his days. It's effectively a negative confession to say what he hasn't done. Because the more usual form of defence would be to challenge the accuser to provide evidence of wrongdoing. Job's friends had indeed accused him of a variety of sins, but they'd offered nothing more than there's no smoke without fire assumptions by way of proof. So Job now uses this series of oaths in this chapter to clear his name along the lines of, if I have done A, then let my punishment be B. But this is not an appeal back to the friends. This is not an appeal back to humans. This is an appeal to God. For it is standing before God that Job's concern is above everything else. Now, like me, Job's not a lawyer, so perhaps even like this sermon. His case isn't divided into neat categories, delivered with dispassionate objectivity. At times, the sin and the punishment are balanced, as we saw in today's one. Let me sow and another eat, and let what grows for me be rooted out. But at other times, one or other of these is missing. Read chapter 31. But is spoken with all the passion of an offended dignity, strident integrity, as befits our Job, of course. But it is 31 chapters on, and Job now, weakened by grief, by deep physical suffering, and the burning heat of that unshaded rubbish dump, knows that everything he is as a human being, a husband, hello Mrs. Job, and a believer in God is now at stake. As I said, if we were to read the whole of chapter 31, and I really do ask you to do that, that little reading is only a taster of this chapter. We'd realise that Job is using the past to shape his future path. This is the person I have been, and this is the person that I will continue to be. It's almost like Scrooge in some ways, I suppose, if you want to start thinking about some of the analogies. If I've been dishonest, then may others profit from it rather than me. Later in this chapter, if I've committed adultery, even in my mind, then may my wife repay me with unfaithfulness herself. Well, I do say hello, Mrs. Job. It's not the nicest way of describing a wife, of course. Further on, if I've threatened the vulnerable with violence, or if I've used my influence against those who have none, then let my arm fall from the shoulder, so that I am stripped of that power. Now, adultery, obviously, other things are echoes here of both the Ten Commandments, perhaps directly and indirectly, but also for us Christians, we'll hear echoes in this chapter of something akin to Jesus' own teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. Job is prepared to be tested in matters that are personal rather than social, private rather than public. He pinpoints in this chapter lust, falsehood, desire, greed, selfishness, covetousness, idolatry, gloating, swearing, and a lack of compassion. Perhaps Job might even be asking, who is my neighbour? It's one thing for Job to say that he'll do no wrong, But he goes further. As we just heard, he's prepared to put the welfare of others on the line by his own oath-making. Poor Mrs. Job. As God watches his every step, Job says, so will I. I will watch my step in future. He'll be careful about what and whom he looks at, and how. Beware the pretty girls, from verse 1. Job will be careful not to loiter, in verse 9. Job will be meticulously honest in all his dealings, as we heard today in verse 6. Let me be weighted in a just balance, and let God know my integrity. Job will keep his heart open to those in need, in verses 16 to 22. Job will not waste time on miserly asset counting. Another thought of Scrooge there, of course, in verses 24 to 28. Job will be sensitive to the suffering of others, in verse 29. And Job will even be concerned for the environment, in verse 38. As we've said many times in this study of Job, put yourself in Job's place. How many of those things are things that we should indeed be caring about today? In short, Job will in future order his life to avoid unnecessary exposure to temptation. In this next bit, we may go slightly away from Job, because Job's motivated in all this by fear. I'm not sure we're always motivated by fear. But it's not fear of other people, whether individuals or groups of people. It's God that Job fears. In verse 23, Job says, I dreaded destruction from God, and for fear of his splendour I could do not such things. Job's issued a challenge to God. But how would God respond? For Job, anything would be better than heaven's silence. If only God would say something, good or bad, anything would be better than nothing. If God would only say something, then Job could attempt to respond to the accusation point by point. He could then engage with God and plead for mercy where he had done wrong. This chapter ends very simply with the words of Job are ended. And you might go, phew, but we've got another 2 weeks of this yet. Okay. But the chapter ends with the words of Job are ended. Job sinks to the ground, exhausted by his last declaration. There's nothing more he can say. A ripple passes through the listening friends. And of course, let's not forget that he still has that human audience. But it's not a ripple of applause or sympathy or encouragement. As you'd expect from his friends, it's of anger that Job still refuses to face the obvious. They're not impressed by his oaths or his passion. Their frustration at being unable to convince him of his wrong remains, and it's sadly stronger than ever. If we're going to continue into verse 32, we're going to find out exactly what they now think of Job or again. So the matter's still not resolved for Job, but already we can learn from the way in which he faces the harsh reality of his circumstances. And the first lesson is the need to be realistic, no matter how much we long for change. It's not holiness or piety to behave as if though our circumstances don't exist, because they do, or that they were other than they are, but they are. Our circumstances are as they exist and as they are, and it's wrong to pretend that we are utterly immune to them. Because until we honestly face our circumstances, we can't begin to deal with the consequences. We'll not seek the grace or we won't need the support that is available, the strength to begin to cope with things as they are, unless we are realistic. But of course, our present is not without a past, obviously. And there's value in looking back, beyond, though, the beginnings of the pain, beyond the gathering of the storm clouds. Every experience of God's grace and God's love, or our friends' earnest support and love, of our own effectiveness, of our own self-confidence. These may well be of times in the past, but they have a message for us today as well. And simply, the God who blesses us then is still the same God. The achievements of the past are achievements still, and as a book says, written in the rocks of history and in the records of heaven. As I said, I was delivering the sermon yesterday on Sunday, and Emma had just won the US Open. So we may not have medals, $1.2 million, whatever it was. We may not have rosettes. We may not even have certificates with which to decorate our walls. But the memory of having done well, the memory of receiving the respect of others, is still relevant. There's refreshment then to draw from the well of our own story. Job's mistake, and it may be the mistake for others too, is to look back with sad nostalgia, because it didn't have to be like that. Job did have good times. Some, when faced with unexpected difficulties, turn in desperation to God, but feel that God's ignoring them in their hour of need. They're disappointed that their prayers are seemingly not answered, or in the way they hoped for, and before long, perhaps they give up, initially on prayer, and then, sadly, on God. Their previous reputation as Christians is soon forgotten. But what, then, will keep us from that same route to spiritual oblivion then? Because we will have those times. Route. Or to keep us, from the same route to spiritual oblivion. It's a simple word, isn't it? Faith. Perhaps we need to express that in the same force and the same compassion as Job's last speech here this Sunday. But perhaps we can only express it with a weary, weary whisper. But it's faith nonetheless. And Job knew that for all he suffered, his Redeemer liveth. Job knew for all that he had suffered and was suffering, what was true about God when he was prosperous was true when he was penniless. And even though he was soon to discover things about God which went far beyond his earlier understanding, look forward to Sarah's sermon next week, he knew that God does not change. Similarly then, for you and for me, God did not change the day you lost your job. God didn't change the day that you had bad news, that your family became ill, or the day that your friend died. God didn't change. God was then, God is now, and God is in those times to come. I had a bookmark in this book, Is Your God Too Small?, which is what we've been following in this Job study. And it says from Hebrews 13:8, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today and forever. And likewise, James reminds us in his letter, chapter 1, verse 17, that our Heavenly Father does not change like shifting shadows. God is utterly dependable. Job understands the implications of this. He'll not only believe now, he will behave. He'll not use his disappointment to excuse lower standards or to give way to his weaknesses. The fact that his upright life, and remember those early chapters from Job, consider my son Job, the upright man, because the fact that his upright life has not resulted in unfettered happiness, he's on that ash heap. It's not going to deter him from continuing to live to please God. Yes, he had hoped for better, and he can't understand why it's not been granted. But he will still be honest. He will still be honourable. Though all that remains to him is his walk with God, without its earthly comforts, he will still choose this pathway. So this is a practical and honest faith demonstrated by Job. To trust God, even though reason and emotions protest, although storm clouds envelop us. We know, and for anybody that's flown it during the daytime will know, if you've come out of an airport and there's clouds above you, you rise above the clouds. We know that beyond those storm clouds, the sun still shines. Job's patience will be rewarded, just as ours will be. Amen.